Hey guys, in this episode we're using the new UE5 modeling mode to transform this bridge, and we're going to paint paths across our landscape. Let's get to it. Welcome to today's episode, and today we're focusing on a brand new mode called the modeling mode. Increasingly, Unreal Engine is putting together tools that allow you to do basic static mesh shaping, editing, molding without going into a third-party program. And that's exactly what we're going to do today. So we're going to bring a bridge asset from, ironically, Quixel Bridge into our level. And then I'm going to show you how we can cut that bridge into a few different pieces so that we can assign different materials for the railings, for the corners, for the actual wood that's spanning the bridge. And then we're going to reset the pivot point for those meshes in the modeling mode so that they can all come together in a single location. And once we have that bridge spanning between our earth quadrant and our water quadrant, that's going to set us up to be able to sculpt out our paths through those two quadrants. And we're going to use a static mesh of pebbles to actually populate our walkway across the quadrants. And we're going to have literally thousands of these meshes on our walkway. So it's going to run into a performance issue. But using detailed stats, we're going to quickly be able to see what that performance issue is and fix it just like that. So here are the key concepts I want you to take away today. Tiling we've already covered before via landscapes, and this is going to be the same concept but just on static meshes for the actual bridge. And the other concepts, plane cut, pivot point, those are related to the modeling mode that we're going to dive right into. So in our last episode, we finished painting our earth quadrant and our water quadrant here and did a lot of things to improve performance. In this episode, once again, you're going to need some assets from Quixel Bridge. So if you go down in the description below, there's a link to the spreadsheet. And if you copy and paste the codes from the spreadsheet into Quixel Bridge, then you can find it and quickly download it. Just a quick note, make sure to download the rocks, walls, and bridge at nanite quality. And also download the materials on the material tab of the spreadsheet at the highest quality. And the other preparation step that you'll need to do is enable complex collision on our bridge, walls, and rocks, the same way we've done in previous episodes. So this episode we're focused on making pathways through our garden here. But to get from one quadrant of our garden to the other, we need a bridge. And so luckily on Quixel Bridge, I did find a bridge asset. And it's this Japanese stone bridge here. So I'm going to position it quite a bit upstream. And I'm going to change the rotation to be 97 on the Z-axis. That'll align it that way. And I'll make it about 3 times the size, so 4 by 3 by 3. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come into foliage mode, and I'm just going to erase some of the foliage around it. So if I select our top asset and come down all the way to the bottom in foliage mode, select everything and check them all. Make sure you're under erase, because if you paint with this, it's going to be devastating. So go to erase, set our brush size to something smaller, maybe about 200, our erase density to 0, and then just erase everything along our bridge here. And I'll go out a little bit because we are going to have a path out from our bridge. Same thing on the earth quadrant side. Alright, that's looking good. So I'm going to go back to select mode. Now the main issue with this bridge isn't really the shape of it, but it's the material, right? So if I get close, it just looks like kind of old, faded concrete that's seen better days. I'd like to have a different material. So if we select that bridge, and then in the material here, I can search for, let's say, like wooden planks, which is another material asset that I've downloaded this episode. And once that loads, like, wow, those are some of the biggest wooden planks I've ever seen. So what can we do to fix that? Well, that's a tiling issue. Let me show you how we fix that. We just come right into the child material here by double clicking on it. Very similar to what we previously did with child materials, there's an option, a parameter all the way at the top for tiling offset. You can check that and then come down, and I'm going to change the tiling to be about 8 and do it for both X and Y so that it's both dimensions. So there we go. That's a much better looking bridge. The planks actually look legit. But the issue is that the whole bridge is made up of those planks. And really what I'd like is I'd like a stone side, like a stone facade on the side and also these corners, and then keep the planks in the center where the bridge actually goes across the river. So how can we do that? Well, we can't do it as it currently stands because this is just one mesh. This is just one asset, and the one asset has one material. But luckily, Unreal Engine provides a really good solution through the modeling mode, because if we simply split this mesh into 3 different parts, we can give them 3 different materials, and then we can put them together again. So let's start by navigating to some empty space over here, because I want to drag in our Japanese stone bridge, and I'm going to adjust my camera speed to be about 2 so I can get in really close to it. So basically what we need to do is we need to split off the railings from the center piece of this, and then they're going to be 2 different materials, one for the railings and one for the center. So to start, we'll go into modeling mode, and that's the 5th mode here on the left hand side. And now there's a ton of stuff in this modeling mode that we're not going to cover. And there are a lot of other tutorials out there. I'm going to post some of my favorites in the description below, and feel free to check them out. But for this particular problem we're trying to solve with the bridge, we're going to use the plane cut feature. So if you select that, what the plane cut does is it allows us to slice this mesh in basically any way we see fit. And right now it's slicing it horizontally, but I want to flip that to vertical. So I'm just going to drag the red axis until it's a 90-degree angle up. And then I'm going to move it over to the left-hand side. I'm going to move it all the way over until I start seeing the railing, and then we're going to move it back. I want to make sure that none of the railing is showing. Now, to make sure I'm getting all of it as precisely attuned as possible, I recommend changing your snap sizes here from 10 down to 1. And you can zoom in pretty close. So I see I'm still getting some of the railing. I'm going to drag in a little bit more until I've got all of it. All right, so now it's going to be sliced off. But here's the thing about our modeling mode here. If I accept this as is, it's going to save our one bridge mesh without that railing. And really what I need to do is I need to save both sides of that. So there's an option for keep both halves, and we definitely want to check that. I typically set that last because without that checked, you can more easily see where it's going to slice. And then I check it right before I save. The other setting I typically adjust is where I save the assets. So instead of the AutoGen folder, I'm going to save them in the current folder. So that means that the two new assets, the one for the bridge without a railing and the one for the railing, they're both going to be saved under this folder here. All right, now we can hit accept. And so now we have our two separate assets. I can drag out that railing and I can drag out the rest of the bridge. And if I come into our content drawer here, I can see those right here. So now I'm going to do the same exact thing on the other side of the bridge. So we'll select plane cut. And then I'm going to uncheck the keep both halves, because remember, that's how I'm able to see what it's about to cut. I recommend flipping this in the opposite direction actually, so that we can see exactly where the railing stops and starts. So if I drag this over a little bit more, yeah, so there the railing comes into focus, so I can just calibrate it perfectly so that none of the railing shows up. And then I can come up here and say keep both halves again. And it's still set to current folder and accept. So now I'm just going to rename these. So if I navigate to the content drawer, I can right click on our centerpiece and rename. I'm going to call this Japanese Stone Bridge Center. And the other two I'm going to rename Japanese Stone Bridge Railing 1, Japanese Stone Bridge Railing 2. We're done with modeling mode for a bit. I'm going to go back to select mode, and I can just clear these out of my level because we have to go back to where our bridge actually is. Gotta up my camera speed for this. All right, so here's our bridge location. Let's drag in our pieces. And I'll delete out the other piece that I started with, just so I'm starting with a fresh slate. And so to get the same properties for all three, I'm just going to select 1, select 2, select 3. I'm going to select the scale to be 4 by 3 by 3. And I'm going to rotate them to 97 degrees. And now what's neat about these is because all three come from the same static mesh, they all still share the same pivot point. So what that means is if I put the same location into all three, they're all going to come together as a perfect bridge. So here's what I mean by that. If I put in a location of -6530, -6350, and then 0, and I'm just going to take that and put that for all three. And if you're not sure that the bridge is centered on the river, you can just come down underneath and then drag all three to the appropriate location. All right, so now we're going to assign a different material for our railings compared to our centerpiece here. So if I select the very center, come over to our materials, if I search for wooden planks, so there are the wooden planks that we just selected. And now if I select our one railing, select our second railing, come over to our materials, if you search for a mossy flagstone floor. And now we have two different materials for our bridge. But there's a couple of issues here, right? So one is that the tiling for this is off. So let's go into that mossy flagstone floor. We'll adjust the tiling. So we'll come up here. I'm just going to change it to about 8. Save. Let's take a look. Yeah, that's looking much better. The other issue is more aesthetic for me, but just I feel like the planks are a little bit too dark relative to the two different quadrants. And so what I want to do is I'm going to go into the planks. I'm going to go into the texture map here. And I'm just going to lower the brightness curve down to 0.9. And that's going to make it an overall brighter material. And that's also for the RGB curve. Yeah, a little bit lighter, a little bit better. Just goes better with the overall motif. There is another really cool trick here that's worth knowing about. If you come into the materials, you can actually rotate the planks if you want. So under tiling offset, it's under rotation angle here. This rotation angle goes from 0 to 1. So basically 90 degrees would be 0.25 because you're turning it a quarter of the way. So I can change this to, let's say, 0.25. So there we go. So that rotated these, rotated those, but it actually doesn't align with the mesh. So that's why I'm going to go back into the material. Just going to revert that. Yeah, much better. Now I do notice another issue here, which is that the wood doesn't actually go to the edge, right? I want it to go right up against the stone so it's not obviously cutting over to a different material. So the first thing I have to do is I have to raise up the wood slightly to be just above the level of the sides here. So I'm just going to make this location one tiny bit, and then I can bring in our 2 railings here. Yeah, so if I zoom in now the wood's almost right against it. Zoom in a little bit more, a little bit more. Yep, there we go. That's about good. I would do the same here, but I can't tell, right? There's a shadow there, and I can't see exactly where it's meeting. So how can I fix that? So for this, I'm going to drag in a light, what's called a point light. And that point light, I can just place it exactly where I want so I could easily see. And let's make that a little bit less bright. So I'll tone that down to be about 1/10 as strong. And now I can actually see it. So let's move this over until I reach the very edge there. That looks good. And I can delete that point light. We're going to use a point light again later in the episode for the same kind of thing. All right, so now that I've adjusted the railings relative to the center of the bridge, let's adjust our pivot points so that all 3 are in the very center. So if I select the 3 assets, so I can just hold control and click, 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 we're going to come back to our modeling mode, and under transform, there's an option for pivot. I'm going to select that. And then I'm selecting center here in the box position to choose the very center. But I also want to change the rotation of the pivot to actually match. And there we go with our rotation, so I can hit accept. And that means whenever I pull in these 3 assets in the future, if I put in the same location for all 3, then they're going to position themselves just like you see here. But there's one last thing I want to do with this bridge, and this part's optional. It's more aesthetic than anything else, so really up to you whether you want to do it. And that's to do another plane cut where we take off our corners of our bridge and we replace those with a different asset. And I'll show you what I mean here. So just go ahead and select our 2 railings, so hold control. We can do this for both assets simultaneously, which is pretty neat. If I go to plane cut, and for this I need to rotate until it's facing long ways. I'm going to uncheck that keep both halves again, and then I'm going to spin it up. And so now I'm going to move this till we get to the very corners. So these are the pieces that I want to cut off. So I gotta make it a bit further. There we go. And for this, I want to make sure to uncheck keep both halves because I don't want to keep the ends. And then accept. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the opposite 2 corners. So we'll do a plane cut. And one thing I'm noticing is because my bridge is 97 degrees and each of these snap at 5-degree angles, it's slightly off the 2 sides. But honestly, I feel like that's going to give the bridge some character, so I'm not going to worry about that too much. All right, and hit accept. In worst case scenario, if you mess this up, you can always just download the bridge again from Quixel Bridge. All right, so that's it for modeling mode. So for the rest of the episode, it's really focusing more on aesthetics. We're going to be finishing this bridge. We're going to be setting up our paths. So I hope you stick around. But let's get to it. So I'm going to come back into our main palette folder. And I'm actually using this Japanese gravestone for the 4 corners of our bridge. So if you drag that in, and we're similarly going to size it up to the scale of our bridge. So if we size it up to 3, 3, 4. I'm also going to give it a 97-degree angle. And by the way, you don't have to choose a 97-degree angle. Just make sure it matches the bridge. Your bridge angle should match whatever angle the river is flowing at. And actually, because the cutting was done at 5-degree increments, I really have to give it a 95-degree angle. And I'm just going to place it a little bit lower. Make sure it's embedded into the ground. And then once we've got it positioned, you can copy, paste, and just reposition a second one. And you'll notice because of what we did in episode 8 that the ground just blends right into it. All right, so now I'm going to select both, Control-C copy, Control-V paste, and I'm going to move them to the other side of our bridge. I'm just going to erase this one little palm tree here. All right, so now we've got to give our corners a new material as well. So we've got a material right for the occasion. So if you come back to Megascans, Surfaces, I created this Bridge Materials folder. And in this, we've got the 3 materials from the spreadsheet that's in the description below. And the material that we're going to assign our corners is this flagstone floor. So I can just type it here. And you see it's quite a bit lighter than our mossy flagstone floor. So I'm going to select the remaining 3, and I'll do the same. And so to lighten our mossy flagstone floor, I'm just going to go into that material. I'll go into the texture, do the same trick I've already been doing. Brightness curve 0.9, RGB curve 0.9, and we'll go ahead and save. So it's slightly different coloring than these, but I feel like it matches pretty closely. There's one other trick for getting the coloring right. If you go back into the material, there's an option to do an albedo tint. So I can select that, click on the color to get the color wheel, and I'm just going to make this slightly less brown, so away from that part of the spectrum, which is in the opposite direction over here. And then for our pillar material, I'm just going to darken these very slightly. If I come into them, and if I go into the texture, I'm going to make it 1.05, 1.05. So the very last thing we're going to do for our corners here is also aesthetic. We're going to change the tiling to up it slightly. So instead of 1, just 2. That means the rocks will be a little bit smaller. Yeah, I like that look. It just matches more closely the tiling of our railings while still making it clear it's not exactly the same material. And in future episodes, I think I'm going to decorate these bridges even more. I might have stuff growing out of these pillars and lanterns or things like that. So we'll see how that goes. All right, so on the earth quadrant side, it looks like this is almost done. We just got to maybe change our sculpting a little bit here to align it properly. But on our water quadrant side, it's a little bit too far off the ground, right? So what do we do here? Well, we need stairs to bring it back down to earth, so to speak. So if you go back to the content drawer, go back to Megascans, we downloaded under 3D Assets, Lakes, Rivers, Paths, Main Palette, we have our Japanese Park stairs. And I'm going to drag these in. First thing I've got to do is I've got to rotate it a bit, so 187. And I've also got to shrink them a bit to align them properly with the bridge size. So I'm going to put the scale down about 0.8. Now the one thing we notice is that the steps here are actually blending into our landscape, and that's because of what we did episode 8. So if I come back into the material, I can turn that off if I want to by selecting all these and setting them to 0. But alternatively, I could set this to blend at a lower level. So maybe I just want the last level of the stairs to start having some of that forest floor. So I could set this to maybe like 15 instead of 50. We could take a look at this in real time. Yeah, so now I see it at the lowest level. So I ended up making the stairs a z-axis of 1.0 just so it aligned perfectly with the top of the bridge, and then that bottom layer was truly blended into the landscape. But now, because these stairs are a little bit darker than the rest of it, let's lighten those. So same trick, go back into the texture, 0.9, 0.9. Now we need something for the side of our stairs here. And for that, if I go back to Lakes, Rivers, Paths, Main Palette, I've got a modular stone wall that we can use. So there's a large one, and then there's 2 smaller ones. So pick var 2 here, you can drag it in. Just need to rotate it 97 degrees. Or actually the opposite, so negative 83. And I'm just going to position it directly adjacent to our stairs. All the way up against our pillar. And then we're going to switch the material to our mossy flagstone. So it's basically going to be the same thing as our bridge. You'll see it blend pretty closely with the stairs. And once you've got that, you can duplicate it. Control-C copy, Control-V paste. And we're just going to put a second one. I know I've got too much foliage here covering it, but we got a second one that I can cover just like this. So the idea is we've got 2 of these that blend right into our bridge railings. And then when I've got both, I can Control-C copy, Control-V paste. I can rotate them over 97 degrees. And now for these, you're going to need to change their relative location to each other. And I'm just going to drag in our stairs a little bit more so that we're covering this corner here. And I'm going to change our Y scale to 1. All right, that's looking pretty good. So let's hit play and we'll try this out. So running across our bridge, running down our stairs. Yeah, looks good. Except, uh-oh, what's going on here with our stairs? So I did not enable complex collision on our stairs. So let's go ahead and do that. So if I go into our stairs mesh, come down here, and instead of project default, need to set this to use complex collision as simple. So remember to set that for all the meshes that we're using this episode. The only remaining issue is the underbelly of our bridge, because I can literally look up into it. It's not designed to look at from that angle. So how do we address that? So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to drag in one of those point lights again so I can get a good sense of how that looks. So I'm going to expand the radius to be about 500, and that should then illuminate the entire area pretty well. Just need to reposition it a little bit lower. Maybe make it a little bit brighter as well. Let's change it to 20. Yeah, there we go. So now I can see everything that's going on down here. So basically we're going to have a wall that surrounds this area, and it's going to blend in seamlessly with the railings of our bridge. So if you go back to your content drawer, it's this modular stone wall, the big one this time. Select that, we're going to drag it in, and we're going to rotate it in the other direction. So we're going to do negative 173 degrees, and move that into position. And at this point, I can lower the brightness of our light a little bit because that's a little too intense. So I can put it down to 8. Yeah, that's better. But the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to expand this slightly just so I get it flush with our bridge. So the scale is going to be 1.3, 1.3, 1.3, and move it into position. And I thought about a couple different ways of doing this. So we could have the wooden beam kind of appear right above it and have part of that wall kind of sticking into the bridge, making it appear like it's holding it up. That looks kind of cool. But I actually think it looks better if I just have it flush like this. And then you might say, but it's not tall enough. It doesn't go down. So easy solution to that, right? You just control copy, control V paste, and we just push it a little bit further. And you can't even tell where one mesh starts and one ends. I guess you can sort of tell with that little line there. So if you want to address that, there's an easy way. You could select the bottom one, and you see how the green is the axis that's on. And we can change the location there by just a single unit. So let's say 33. Now that was pushed inward, so let's do 35. And then when we do that, that blends seamlessly, right? So we got a little bit showing there, but I actually like the way that looks. It kind of looks like it's a water level, a water stain or something like that. And up here, it looks like it's just holding up our bridge like it should be. For this grass that's sitting there, I just want to go get out of the way, but can't do it. Okay. So now you can imagine the water kind of flowing directly through this channel here, right? And the last thing we got to do is these corners on this side. We're going to do the same kind of thing. So I got to move our light into position so I could actually see those corners. This would be a cool place for a secret tunnel, entrance to a secret cavern, something like that, right? I'll keep it in mind for the future. All right, so let's go right back to our modular stone wall. This one, drag that in, and then set the rotation to 97 degrees. Put that into position. And this is where our light comes in handy so we can see exactly where it's going to line up. And I'm going to set it to the same exact scale. So 1.3, 1.3, 1.3. And you know, there's still a tiny little hole there, right? So it's an easy fix. You just Control-C copy, just move it right over a little bit and position those to take up the hole. And even if they're a little bit staggered, you know, that's totally fine because it'll just look like a separate wall that's connecting to the first one. So let's take all 4 of these assets, right? And now we're just going to copy them and we'll paste them on the other side. And then we'll just drag them into position. So how's that looking? Pretty good? So we could keep it this modular stone wall material and give it kind of a mossy feel when it's close to the river. But I kind of want it to just blend automatically in with the bridge railings here. So let's change all of these. If I hold Control, and actually what I can just do is I can just select all of them in our world outliner. Modular stone wall, come down to the bottom one, select all these. Okay, they're all selected. Then we can go to materials and we can just change all of these to the mossy flagstone. And there we go. So now the sides kind of blend seamlessly with the bridge here. So now we're going to pivot quite a bit and we're going to cut paths through our entire garden, or at least these 2 quadrants of our garden, starting from our bridge. And I want some winding paths so I can't really see that far into the distance. And also we're going to leave the middle of our 2 quadrants empty because I'm going to have some specific gameplay stuff that's going on in the middle of the quadrant. We'll save that to a subsequent episode. So to sketch a path in our garden, I'm going to go over to foliage mode. And what we're going to do is basically cut out all foliage in a certain area. So if I select the very top foliage type, come down all the way to the bottom, select the very bottom, select all, make sure you're in erase for this because otherwise there'll be all sorts of problems when you paint. And we're going to change our brush size to about 200. And I'm going to zoom out a little bit more. And I'm just going to do a winding path pretty close to the river all around our quadrant here. And in any spots that you accidentally erase, you could select only rocks here and change your paint density to something like 0.005 and then paint just in those spots. Alright, so now that we've removed all the foliage in those areas, the next thing that we have to do to really get the effect that we're looking for is we need to flatten it out. And to do that, we need to navigate over to landscape mode. Now I tried to do this with flatten, but the problem is the way I sculpted the earth quadrant, it's just too high off the ground, so it's too uneven. And so the only way I've gotten the right effect is to use erase, to basically erase all the height data across our paths. And the reason that our paths need to be flat is because we're going to paint just meshes of pebbles across the entire thing. And if those meshes get staggered a little bit, you're going to see where some pebbles are kind of floating above others. It's not going to look right. So I'm going to switch to erase under landscape mode here. And for the brush size, I'm going to set this to about 400. And make sure you're in our sculpting layer because it won't work if you're in the paint layer. And then set our tool strength to 1 because we're erasing all the height data over our paths. And steer clear from our bridge. We're going to take care of that last. So I'm going to start from about right here. And you should see the entire landscape lower. What's neat though is that the foliage actually recalculates, so it'll actually calibrate itself to be aligned with the landscape even when it lowers. And if you see any issues like this where our landscape is raised, that just means we missed it when we were erasing. So I can come back to erase. I can just go over that one more time. And you might notice that some assets are kind of sticking up above the ground a little bit after we erase our paths. And the reason for that is that some parts of our landscape are still kind of high up, while the paths are what we lowered. So what I would do in that case is I would go back into landscape mode, stick with erase, and just run the erase over everything in that general area. And that should fix the issue. Alright, so now we're ready to start painting pebbles all across our paths in our earth quadrant here. So let's go back to select mode. And for this, we have to go back into our content drawer. Let's go to 3D Assets, Lakes, Rivers, Paths, Main Palette. And what we're using for our paths is this Nordic Beach rocky ground. It's basically a thin layer of pebbles. I found it really looks nice as path material. And if I navigate over to foliage mode, one really neat trick is if you just drag in the mesh asset into foliage here, then it automatically prompts you to create a foliage asset, and you could specify, yep, I want it in that same folder, save. And then if I go back to our content drawer, there it is. So let's go into that foliage asset. So there's a few settings we need to change in here. So I'm going to set these rocks to be very slightly below the landscape. So a minimum of -5 and a maximum of -4. We're also going to average the normal. I'm going to set the max angle to be 1 degree. And for collision, I'm going to set this to no collision because there's already a landscape below. And I actually like how it looks where the feet go slightly into the pebbles, like they're digging into it. And in a future episode, we're definitely going to work on sound effects with our player. So for example, the feet hitting certain materials and then playing a certain sound like crunching pebbles underneath the feet. All right, so we'll save that. And now we can make sure every single foliage asset is unchecked here. So come down to the bottom, select everything, check, check. And this very bottom one, Nordic Beach Rocky Ground, this is going to be our one asset we are painting all over. Now here's the fun part. We get to crank up the density for this like crazy. So we're going to crank this up to about 400 per 10 by 10 meter space. And our paint density up here is going to be set to 1. But before we paint, there's one more setting we forgot to change, and that is our blending in with the landscape. We do not want these pebbles to blend in. So if you go back to the content drawer, select the material here, we want to disable our 3 parameters here. So we want to set those all to 0. All right, so now we're finally ready to paint. And because we erased all the height data, you'll see our pebbles just filling in there. And with a density of 400, there's just a very few parts where our landscape is showing through. And you're going to see this number get quite high. And if you see this happening, that's exactly why we erased our landscape height data, because our landscape's uneven and then it's painting in that staggered way. So now I'm going to do some very careful sculpting around our bridge here. So I'm in landscape mode, in sculpting, erase, and I'm going to change our tool strength to like 0.01, lower our brush size to about 200, and I'm just going to very gently go over this whole area here. And actually, I got to lower our tool strength even more. Yeah, just very gently. And I'm going to raise it up in the middle there, just so that's flush with the bridge. All right, let's see what our FPS is, and we're going to hit play and see how this looks. And I can zoom in very, very close, And just look at the level of detail of all those stones on the ground. I could just navigate through my quadrant, through the labyrinth of rocks. I'm liking this a lot. But there's a problem. Our frame rate is beginning to drop. What's going on here? Well, one part of the problem you might think is the fact that we have 11.7 thousand of these. And in our mesh, we've got, what do you think that is? 1,000 rocks? So we got 1,000 times 11.7, you know, roughly 1,000,000 rocks, 1,000,000 pebbles that we painted in there. So that would cause a performance issue, right? But not with nanite. So the reason that there's a slight dip in performance is because within our static mesh foliage type, we actually have it set to currently cast a shadow. And for those rocks, they're all the way flush to the landscape, right? They're not going to cast a shadow on anything. So we can turn that off. Yeah, so that upped our frame rate by about 3 or 4 right there. And this really is the crazy awesome Unreal Engine 5 functionality up close and personal. It's like we have these rocks that look realistic, millions of rocks. Well, there's about 1,000,000, but we're going to have even more. And the engine can handle that with literally a 0 drop in frame rate. Now, the last thing I'm going to do for decorating our paths in the earth quadrant is I'm going to line these with some smaller rocks on the sides, just for a decorative effect. And so if I come into our content drawer and go back to our main palette, it's these small limestone rocks here, and they were the only mesh asset that we downloaded this episode that doesn't have nanite selected by default. So if you double click on each of the meshes, and you're going to need to set this checkbox for enable nanite support, apply changes. And regarding collision, I don't recommend for these little rocks to set collision complexity to use complex collision as simple, because we're going to have a ton of these rocks, and they're so small that instead we could just add a 26 DOP simplified collision, and that's going to work just fine. So our player's foot's going to rest on top of it, not even going to see the difference that the foot actually isn't on the rock itself, and then save. So just do that for each one of the meshes. There's 2 other things we're going to do here. So first is, if you go into the child material, once again, we're going to disable these 3 values. We don't want our rocks blending into the landscape. And then the other thing we're going to do is they're a little too light. If you come into our texture here, we can change our brightness curve to be about 1.2. Same with the RGB curve. And so let's make 6 foliage assets. So we'll right click, go to foliage, static mesh foliage, and I'll call this earth quadrant path rock 1. And then I'll double click to go into it, and we'll search for our small limestone rocks, select the first one. And for these, I'm going to set the Z offset to be about -15 to -10 because they're going to be a little bit larger. And we're going to set this random pitch angle to be 90 degrees. And that's basically the rock can rotate not just this way, but it can also rotate 90 degrees this way. So it can kind of be on its side. And that's going to give the illusion that we actually have more than 6 kinds of rocks. For these, I'm going to give a cull distance of 10,000. And for collision, I'm going to set these to block all dynamic. And if you haven't done so already, you'll want to go on each static mesh asset and set up collision. All right, so now let's duplicate our foliage asset 5 times. And we'll go into each one, just change the static mesh asset. And now you guys know the drill. We go into the foliage mode. We're going to drag our 6 foliage assets in there. And they're all the way at the top for our earth quadrant path rocks. But just make sure that we go down to the bottom, uncheck our Nordic beach rocky ground, and then we select all 6 of them, check, and we're going to set the scale of these to be a little bit larger, so about 1.8 to 2.2. And now a crazy density for these. We're going to set these to be a density of about 1,000. But here's how this is going to work. We're going to set our brush size to be absolutely minuscule, size 10, because it's only going to be painted on the very edges of our path here. All right, so here we go with the painting. And actually, even though I darkened them already, they're still kind of light. So I'm going to go back to our content drawer, and I'm going to up this to 1.3 for each. And where it's really narrow, I'm just not going to paint in those areas. And then you could just go through and thin out the rocks where you don't want them, like choke points, that sort of stuff. So that's looking pretty good, but it did drop our frame rate a lot because each of those does have a shadow, and we do want to keep those. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to lower our cull distance for those rocks. I can just come into each one, change that to be about 5,000. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into our Nordic rocky ground foliage asset. I'm going to set the cull distance to this to also be 5,000. All right, now we're back into the 60s. That's a little bit better. So on we go to our water quadrant. Same process. Let's start off in foliage mode. We're just going to cut a path through and change our brush size to about 200. And remember, we want a winding path through our water quadrant because we don't want the player to be able to see too far out and see some of those assets culling in the distance. And one little trick I've got here is try to follow the areas that are already kind of sparsely populated. So that's looking pretty good. So now we're going to do the same thing in landscape mode. I'm just going to erase all the data. Tool strength to 1. Let's do our brush size about 800. And I'll run that all along our paths here. All right, we are ready. So let's unselect everything except our rocks all the way at the bottom. Change over to paint. And for this, I'm going to set our brush size a little bit wider. So 300. And away we go. It's like watching little pixels of sand draw themselves in. All right, last but not least, we want to go back into our content drawer, and we're going to go to this main palette VDK Jab 2IW. These are going to be the rocks that we line our water quadrant paths. And so for each of these, once again, we have to enable collision, but we also need to create foliage assets for each of them. And so what you could do is if you go back to main palette and go into the small limestone rocks, you could select all 6 of these, and then you could just drag them into the VDK Jab 2 and just say copy. But it's actually easier, I think, if you just duplicate one, you assign the correct rock. I'm going to rename this one, and this is going to be our water quadrant. And then I could just right click and duplicate it 6 times. And then we'll do the same thing where we change out the mesh for each. Now over to foliage mode, and we drag in our assets one more time. These are going to be all the way at the bottom. You can unselect our paths. Select all of these, and we can keep the scale there 1.8 to 2.2. That's perfect. The density at 1000. Change our brush size back down to 10. And one difference for our painting strategy here for our water quadrant, make sure to paint it on the outside of the pebbles. So paint it close to the pebbles, but still kind of underneath the foliage, if that makes sense. You don't want these being so obvious, kind of showing up on the pebbles. Yeah, so that's perfect. They're kind of sticking out there. They're not at all obvious. They're underneath the palms. That's exactly what we want to see. And so, running through this, can we imagine being in the lost world and a velociraptor just charging right out of the jungle? Yeah, I am getting that feel. So our frame rate here now is dipping into the 40s, and that's really not good. And so we got to do some additional troubleshooting to see what exactly is causing our frame rate to drop, other than, of course, the sheer obscene amount of foliage we have going on in our water quadrant. But I think there's some things that we can do to actually boost up this frame rate quite a bit. And so I want to go into some more advanced stats that we can troubleshoot with. So if you come up to the top left corner, we have our show FPS that we've already covered, but if you come under stat here and under engine, almost always the next thing I like checking is the detailed stats. And that shows up directly next to our FPS there. And you get a sense for what's kind of orange or yellow there. If I move around, I can see that our GPU and our draw calls are pretty high. So basically the GPU seems to be struggling. So the next thing I'd look at is our GPU stats. So if I come back up to stats, and if I go under advanced, then I can scroll down to our GPU. And this gives a really detailed view of what's actually causing our GPU to work hard. And I see here that basically it's shadows. So shadows are killing our GPU. But as I'm looking at our rocks that are underneath our foliage here, I'm thinking to myself, well, all these brown rocks, we don't really need to enable shadows for all these, do we? Because they're all underneath the foliage. And so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to disable shadows on all of these brown rocks here. And so watch our shadow depths of 5.8, and let's try that out. So if I go back to our content drawer, if I go into each of these foliage assets, I can just uncheck the cast shadow checkbox, and I'm going to do this for each one. So that definitely helped a little bit. It brought down our shadow depths from about 5.8 to 5. And if I wanted to, I could also go over to the earth quadrant and do the same thing for these, but they're a little bit more obvious, right? Like I can actually see the shadow there, and I like that effect. Also over here in the earth quadrant, because there's not as many foliage assets, the performance isn't nearly as bad. So you see our shadow depths there is only 4.6. So that concludes our episode. In our next episode, we're going to create what's called a packed level actor, also known as a mega assembly, based on the bridge that we assembled today. And what the packed level actor allows us to do is use that bridge as many times as we like all over our game. But then it's also really easy to modify it and make copies of it so we have all different sorts of bridges all over our game. And once we create a couple different kinds of bridges, we're going to finish our air quadrant that you see in the background there. So I hope to see you there.